So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to a map we haven't actually seen in quite some time but has been in the game for quite a while at this point, and this is of course MISTRAND. Now, I am a little bit concerned about this maybe because given the issues that we've had with Moria on my system as it stands, and Moria never really was too much of a problem as a map outside of the conglomerations of units that can form on it. MISTRAND, however, has given some problems in the past, and those did subside a little bit with new versions of the game as they came out, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't approaching this one with a bit of trepidation. I mean, to be fair, if there is no issues, then you will be seeing this replay now, and if there is, then it will never see the light of day. That's just how it's going to be. So it is kind of a non-issue from your perspective, I suppose, but it does tend to be these big cityscape maps which often threw up the issues. Hopefully that will not be the case this time, because it is a good map. It is very much a street fight between two different opposing armies this time around, and it is going to be the forces of evil that are going to be defending, of course, with MISTRAND being the capital of the Confederation of Tribes that is Rhun. It makes a lot of sense that the Gondorians have come to the aid of Dorwinion in trying to root out this menace once and for all. We shall see if they will be successful, although I don't actually think Rhun themselves are on the map today. I believe it is a combination of Mordor, Khand and Harad, unless I'm very much mistaken. No, Rhun are here, okay. So they are going to be defending their own capital, which is good to see. But we will be going through the attacking armies first and foremost. Just, of course, a little quick overview of the map. Like I said, most of the fighting is going to be done in the streets. Very much a choke pointy map, but interestingly enough for the defenders, they are going to have to be quite careful about where they choose to defend, because while they will be pretty much guaranteed of a choke point, the quality of them can vary a little bit, and it is a 5v3. They're going to need to be on the ball here if they want to win. These odds are something which few armies can overcome easily. We have seen it done, and we've seen it done fairly recently on Tolfalas as well, but we shall see if the forces of evil are capable of doing what the forces of good did there. Starting off with the player who sent me this battle replay, which is Beastie70, so big thank you to him. I do hope that this replay does end up being alright, being that the map has thrown up some problems in the past, given that he was the one who sent me the map, the battle I should say, where it was first made apparent that Moria was going to be a bit of a problem until at least I upgrade my hardware. So hopefully from his perspective it isn't a bad omen. So yeah, we're going to be seeing his Gondorian army here. Gondor infantry with the armour upgrades. He's got some Gondor militia archers as well. When you're on the attack, you have to cut some corners somewhere, and honestly, this kind of archer is exactly the sort of thing which can be really difficult for defenders to deal with. So I do actually think that it's a good move to maybe save a little bit of money on archers as Gondor here, and maybe go a little bit heavier in for your more defensive and bulky infantry. Because it is going to be quite difficult to wear down Gondor and Dorwinion over time. There may be a bit of a question mark over how much damage they're capable of doing if they go overtly defensive, but we shall see. He's gone for the Wardens of the White Tower in and amongst there as well. Very accomplished bodyguard unit, as you would expect from the Gondorian shielded units. Gondor militia infantry are back there as well to pad out the numbers. Very basic, but you know, having a bit of cannon fodder, as I'm sure they will be used for in this battle, is actually somewhat useful, given that they are going to have to attack into a fairly defensive position. There's Pelargian Marines in there. Javelins are always going to be good for dislodging stubborn defensive positions. Some standard Gondor spearmen with the armour upgrade, I believe. Yes, indeed. You can see the slightly different and larger shields, and of course the black capes of the Citadel Guard in there as well. The armour piercing on them could be really useful for thinning out the large quantities of orcs over a long period of time. There is also the Guards of Osgiliath, the unit of pikes that Gondor have at their disposal. Pikes are always a good idea to bring in some capacity, whether you're attacking or defending, because, as I've said several times, if it comes down to the late game and you've got a pike advantage, generally speaking, if you can ensure they don't get shot up, that is a really good way for you to close out a battle, and especially when you've got an army generally as sturdy as Gondor's. There's some Pinneth Galen cavalry with the armour upgrade as well. I mean, MISTRAND does have some wider open spaces, and considering it is a rather big map, they could be used early on as well. We'll see. I'm not sure about the pick myself, mainly because I think you could achieve the same sort of thing with a cheaper unit of cavalry in the Gondorian roster, but they could be useful. A charge from a unit of cavalry like that is always going to be fairly devastating if you can make it land. Then we have Gamer Data, who is going to be playing as another unit of another army of Gondor. Some unupgraded Gondor infantry, but they will still do the same sort of job. And even though I would argue that in pretty much every circumstance you should be looking to upgrade the armour of your Gondorians, at least by the first level, because they are cheaper. But they will still do the job that you want them to, even without the armour upgrades in this sort of situation where you've got to save a bit of money. Nimlothian Honor Guard, I definitely approve of that pick, however, they've got a really good shield value, every bit as defensive as the Wardens of the White Tower, only there are more of them, and the armor piercing they add makes them all around a better unit in my opinion. And then behind here we have some Raven Helms of Caer Andros. They will be really useful actually for chopping through the not necessarily overtly armoured canned and Rhun infantry. Even the lowly orcs are not really going to do too well against these Gondorian swordsmen. 2 units of Wardens of the White Tower is maybe a frivolity that is not something you could afford too easily. I think that's a fairly serious error actually. But we shall see. Mithrandir's retinue, another maybe 2 elite unit for this sort of situation, especially seeing as cavalry can be bottled up a little bit more easily. Single unit of Axemen of Lasarnak. The Trebuchet is also very expensive, and a couple of units of Marksmen of Caer Andros as well. I would assume this is a newer player based on the army composition alone, and based on the fact that I've never seen this name before. But yeah, this is a very bizarre army, and it's very small, differing focuses as well. It's not as if they've gone fully in for the ranged units. They've got artillery, fairly expensive archers, a unit of expensive cavalry, far too much money spent on generals, bodyguard units there, but that is a temptation which newer players often fall prey to. We shall see if he can make it work still. I mean, it is a 5v3, so you can afford to be maybe a little bit frivolous, given the situation is what it is. Then we have Lyon, who is going to be playing as, I assume it's Lyon anyway, as in the French city and not Lion, but he's got some lumbermen hidden over there. He's also got plenty of Elvelyn infantry and Elvelyn Vineguard, as you would expect, a very dependable front line as we have seen, and the Elvelyn marksmen are here as well, so they're not going to be short on options to skirmish with the enemy here, the attackers, which is how, based on the composition so far, I'd actually recommend they set up their initial assaults. Keldon River Patrol as well, so some cheap javelins, as we've already mentioned. Javelins can be very useful for this sort of battle. Morroquendi bows more damaging than the Elvelyn marksmen, so they will probably be saved for later, or at least they should be. Morroquendi pikes, Morroquendi glade masters, so the pikes naturally going to be very useful for later on. And then we've also got the glade masters and the Elvelyn hammer guard as well, 2 very, very strong units, armor piercing and sort of more human based, as you would expect, a little bit more defensive with their armor. The glade masters a little bit more focused around their finesse in melee, but still very impressive units. The second Dorwinion army, played by Mevin, a much more familiar name. He's got 3 units of the Elvelyn Vineguard, several units of the Elvelyn infantry, so definitely going for a very bulky army here. Another unit of Elvelyn infantry and a unit of hammer guard, several units of Elvelyn marksmen and some lumbermen and Nandor glade guard hidden back here. So shock infantry back here hidden will probably be deployed later on, and instead going for that slow burn approach, still based on 4 armies that we've looked at so far. I really assume that that is what the attackers are going to be going for, really trying to wear the defenders down. I mean, it's a bold move to do that against the forces of evil when they've got orcs, because very often you can end up coming out on the wrong side of that engagement if you're not careful, but they've got the tools to be able to do that here, the attackers certainly. And finally, Uncle, who is playing as another Dorwinion army. Several units of Elvelyn infantry, once again, a lot of Elvelyn infantry in fact. He's gone for some Glade Lords, another unit of maybe cavalry that's a little bit too expensive, although more understandable out here, because he could potentially chase down against Rhun, who might not be able to get back into the city quickly enough before they become a bit of a problem for him. We shall see if Uncle wants to be that aggressive with the cav. Morroquendi Glade Masters, and I think this is 3 units of Morroquendi. No, that's 2 units of Morroquendi Pikes. Okay, that's fine. Not going into the red limit again for no good reason. Nandor Glade Guard, so certainly more of an elven look to this army, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It helps balance out Mevin's army a little bit. Good diversity in terms of their strengths. Now, let's have a look at who's going to be defending. Starting off with MG Steelbow, playing as the forces of Rhun, playing on their home turf, very much their home turf. Now, their deployment zone was very constricted, as you can see. This is kind of what happens on maps like this, when you see all of the forces clumped up in a blob like this. Balkoth Tribesmen, another unit of cavalry, the Carmel's Dragon Knights. I need to be a little bit careful, actually, because while they are a very durable unit of cavalry, the Morroquendi Glade Lords are the sort of thing that might give them a bit of pause. So they do need to be careful, because if they just trade 1 for 1 and both units essentially cancel one another out, the defenders can afford to take that financial loss less than the attackers. Plenty of armour piercing, as you'd imagine, low gap rim, low flag rim, and all of this armour piercing is going to be very useful on this occasion, given the abundance of Gondorian soldiers and Elvelyn units from Dorwinion as well. Even the Phalanx units will be useful, of course. The gap rim always going to be useful to have that sort of thing. Bringing their crossbows to the field as well, the Eastron crossbows, if they can set up in a good position, that's really going to cut down the effectiveness of all of those more defensively minded Western men that are going to be knocking on their doors. Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen are in there as well, nice body piercing on them. Carmel's Chosen are in there to give their infantry line a little bit more solidity. As you'd expect perhaps from Rhun, plenty of their mainline units, Flag Rim, Gap Rim. I'm not seeing any Scion Rim, interestingly enough. I can't see any of their spears poking out. Maybe he's gone for 2 units of the Carmel's Chosen. They are fairly interspersed there. Could be a few hidden units as well. I'd be very surprised not to see the Carmel's Shadow Bows in a situation like this. Now then, moving into the middle, we have Proxima Centauri playing as Mordor. He's got a Troll Catapult posted up back here. The rest of his army waiting in the streets for the enemy to come forward. Uruk Captains, Nazgul and Temple Executioners making up the triumvirate of elite infantry units that Mordor can bring to the table. Be interesting to see how effective they can be in this sort of situation. The Nazgul in particular can be quite the devastating force. Another unit of high-tier cavalry. Again, can the Melkor's Chosen actually break free of the city and get into areas where they'll be a little bit more useful? I mean, they could be the best melee cavalry unit on the field today, so it could be a real boon to bring them, but we'll have to wait and see. Olag High, the functionally useless, as of the current patch, Troll Drummers, but they look cool. Let's hope that that isn't, again, a frivolity that their team cannot financially take. Orc Javelins are here. They will, of course, be useful on the defence. Morannon Archers. Got some Morannon Halberds in here as well. So a numerous army here. Plenty of the Morannon units to bulk things out. Temple Guard are in there as well. So Morannon units at the core. Some Sauron's Will and Minas Morgul Chosen to add a little bit more quality. And then the really elite units as well. As perhaps you'd expect, fairly standard when it comes to how Mordor usually do their business. And I don't think there's anything else from them, which will bring us on to the final defending army, which is going to be Cand, played by Bard the Bowman. I mean, he's playing as the right faction, I suppose, with regards to evil factions, to be a bowman. Although I'm sure Bard doesn't think too highly of the Variags. Brotherhood of the Spear are here. We've got some Nurad Stormguard, we've got Nurad Footmen, plenty of armor piercing again, which will be useful. Very similar in that way to Rhun. The Stormguard in particular, very deadly unit. The Brotherhood units, Brotherhood of the Sword and Spear, the more defensive Brotherhood units, but still, it does help to have that little bit of an extra defensive edge when you consider that the armor piercing is what most of these units are going to be focused around. Nomadic Marauders, Variag Bowmen, so of course they're going to be pretty at home actually skirmishing with the enemy. On this occasion, I think the Gondorians and Dorwinion together will have the beating of a faction like Cand, even with the armour upgrades as they have here, but it's not too much of a problem. Cand will be in a better position than most to be able to trade back and forth with them, especially with units like the Nomadic Infantry. They're a little bit smaller in number, but they are pretty good at what they do, especially in that sort of environment. Second unit of Nurad Stormguard, I mean, they have the money to splash, the cash to splash, I suppose, do Cand, so bringing 2 units of them is not the worst idea. They're such a strong unit of infantry after all. Another unit of Brotherhood of the Sword, and also the more aggressive Brotherhood unit here in the Brotherhood of the Axe. Once again, that armor piercing, definitely a useful thing. I really like the Cuban style masks that the Brotherhood wear, in addition to sort of like the samurai style as well, a real collision of cultures from the real world there. But yeah, I suppose we will make a bit of a cut, because I would imagine the attackers are all going to set up in a position first. I mean, I could be wrong. Gamer Data could kamikaze into the enemy, or the defenders could try and take him out and isolate him quickly. We'll have to wait and see based on the deployments, but I'll make a cut and we'll rejoin when the battle is about to begin. So after an insanely generous grace period, we're finally getting underway here as the Trebuchet starts to fire. The Pinithgelian cavalry there thinking of charging into the Variag Bowmen, but the presence of the Nurad Halberds makes that an impossibility. Now, at the very least, even though the grace period was what it was, they aren't going to park themselves up in a singular choke point and make the battle all about that. They are going to defend from the front at least a little bit more than that, and I feel as though a decent part of that is based on where Rhun set up. But as you can see, all 3 of the armies have been allowed to set up into a defensive position on the main thoroughfare through the city. And it's a real shame as well, because based on the movements that were happening earlier on in the battle, when no one could attack one another, it could have led to some really interesting situations. But as it is, once again, we have a situation which seems engineered so that the defenders can sit in one position and shoot at the enemy. It's one of my pet peeves has really come to light recently, and I really wish people would stop having these grace periods be quite so extreme, or at least have a simple time limit on them that isn't too generous, so that you have to move either quickly and tire out your men, or do something that makes things a little bit more interesting, rather than just allowing the defenders to sit in a position that's easy. You know, it is what it is. Hopefully the battle will still be interesting in spite of some of the lost potential there has already been. Speaking of which, we already have a melee engagement over here, which is good. Beastie 70 moving in, engaging with the Flagrim and the Gamprim. Now I was going to say as well, with how much heavy armour Gondor and Dorwinion have going on, and the fact that neither one of them are really limited in terms of their numbers, this is going to be a fairly difficult assault to mulch through for the defenders, but their saving grace is they do have plenty of armour piercing between Rhun and Can to be able to do that. Flagrim and Gamprim in particular are going to be really good at dealing with these basic Gondorians, but the presence of those pikes on the front line does muddy the waters a little bit. Dragon's Wrath Guildsman moving in. Pelagia Marines getting into support as well for Beastie's army. Through sheer numbers, Rhun is struggling a little bit here, but through little else. Meanwhile, the main assault down here through the main street, going to be trading back and forth with Arrowfire, Variag Bowman with the armour upgrade, as I said. Exactly the sort of situation they are designed for. The Trebuchet not going to be getting tons and tons of kills in terms of hitting those big blobs because of how spread out the defenders actually are, but they're still getting hits, and that will worry the defenders a little bit because they can't afford to take continuous losses like that. Marksman of Caer Andros here, the superior archer to the Variag Bowman certainly. They do lack a shield value, but their armour does make up for that, and the continued pressure coming forward from the Mithrandir's retinue here will also force some sort of anti-cavalry unit, probably halberds, to come forward and block the advance, which will of course put the halberds into harm's way of the arrow fire as well. And they're already taking a little bit of damage from the trebuchet fire. Nothing too crippling for the defenders yet, but they are already under a fairly decent amount of pressure. Now the Dragon Knights are also a good way of warding off the Mithrandir's retinue. Far better as a cavalry versus cavalry combatant, that unit. Another unit of Flagrim coming in, but the quality on the front line here, provided by the Guards of Osgiliath, is really having the impact that Gondor want. It's a little bit difficult actually here for Rhun to try and get a foothold here in this little side street, which is the only other way that the attackers can advance through, short of advancing all the way around MISTRAND and going up this side road over here. But it takes so long to do that that it's very clear what you're going to be attempting. The Morroquendi Glade Lords can do it, of course, because they're cavalry, and they actually have managed to get in behind enemy lines, and they are ravaging these Eastron crossbowmen as we speak, so that's something else for the defenders to have to try and deal with. I mean, in a 1v1 fight as well between the Glade Lords and the Dragon Knights, I actually back the Glade Lords. Additional melee defense that the Elven Cavalry has would be a real difference maker there. I mean, it would be a highly Pyrrhic victory either way. Both units very, very similar to one another in terms of what they're designed to do. Variag Bowman still taking damage, but still not folding to this pressure just yet. Nurad Footmen, of course, with their really nice shield value, going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with from afar in the way that the attackers may want to try here. Interesting to see the Lumbermen being moved forward first. I mean, they are a very soft target, but they may be so soft that actually the defenders might not want to expend valuable ammunition on them. Problem is, if they do get into melee, they will at least get some kills with that armour piercing that they come with. They're already shaken though. Faced with an army of angry Eastern men as they are, Morannon archers, the Glade Lords are in and amongst things, but not really able to get the charge back there that they were looking for. Nurad Footmen moving forward to engage with the Lumbermen, and the Nurad Footmen, of course, as professional soldiers. Far better defensive values, that'll be just fine. Take the odd loss. I mean, they might not even take any losses if the Lumbermen rout before they're able to actually swing their axes enough to do that damage. And then, of course, their morale is actually being lowered as well by the close proximity of the stench clouds that their own rotting meat is providing. So that's something else to consider as well. Meanwhile, Gondor doing a really good job on Rhun over here, though. The quality as well of the Citadel Guard in and amongst there is probably having a big impact. Yes, the rank and file Gondorians won't do quite so well against stuff like Flagrim. Certainly not against something as good as the Brotherhood of the Axe either, but the addition of the numbers from the lower tier stuff like the militia, the pikes helping keep Rhun at arm's length, and also the real high quality of the Citadel Guard is proving to be a real problem here for Rhun and this little side defence. You can see the nomadic marauders, some Variag Bowmen are in there as well, aggressively pushing forward now. Beastie getting into these Variag Bowmen, exposed as they are, and these are going to be good kills that they can start to rack up as well. The defenders, considering they only have really one thing to keep an eye on, they really do need to get a hold of their own defensive position a little more quickly than they're currently doing here. how accommodating the early game was for them. I was expecting a little bit more of an organised defence here right from the off. Here on the main street things aren't going quite so poorly in terms of the melee engagement, but they have been taking a little bit more damage over time from afar thanks to the artillery and the archers. A few kills from the lumbermen, they have managed to achieve that. Elvelyn infantry moving forward to support the Gondorians as they are. Trying to sneak around the side here with this one unit of heavy infantry, and that is important. They do need to try and cripple the formation of the Nurad halberds here so they can start to make the same sort of progress here through the middle as they are on the side street. So plenty of support in the back. They may be tempted already to try and fall back to this singular choke point here, the defenders, and I think that's exactly what they're doing. Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen and Gamprim running away. The Carmel's Dragon Knights can cover that particular retreat, and these nomadic marauders getting run over. Highly successful assault here from Beastie 70 on the side street. Now we can continue to move forward, maybe try and catch out a few more of these things. Going up to the Gamprim with some of their supporting archers that have pushed forward, getting into a better position to shoot. Lumbermen ready to move in as well. Interesting there, the Elvelyn infantry pulling back, trying to avoid a nasty charge coming from the Melkor's Chosen. Those extremely large great maces that they have. Again, just some anti-cavalry on the front line would help sort things out here. Morroquendi bows a little bit exposed. I think just a single unit of the Elvelyn Vine Guard would be what the situation calls for here, but instead we've just got more infantry moving forward, more marksmen. Do we have any spearmen? There's Morroquendi pikes on the way forward, that would be fine I suppose, but even still. Camel's Dragon Knights, I mean, it's a little bit bemusing as to why there's no anti-cavalry presence on the front line, considering the fact that the Dragon Knights and the Melkor's Chosen probably represent the two most dangerous units in this sort of situation that the defenders have at their disposal, and that was another good charge as well, doing a lot of damage to the standard Elvelyn swordsman. But again, just the momentum carrying the attackers forward, flooding to try and catch out any units that still remain, although I do think there's only one unit that's still not in position, and that's this unit of Gamprim, and these Elvelyn infantry now find themselves exposed to some more charge from the Easterlings' cataphracts. The Mithrandir's retinue are here, but they're not really anti-cavalry. They would be really good at doing the same sort of thing that the Dragon Knights are doing to the Elvelyn infantry, but not so much. They're trying to counteract that. That was a little bit of, well, that was a horrendous mistake actually from Proxima Centauri, charging in, maybe not seeing what kind of unit he was charging into and just trying to get into the thick of it again. And the unit he ended up charging into there was the Morroquendi pikes. So coming back for a second bite of the cherry leads me to believe that he was fully aware that he was charging into Morroquendi pikes, and that is not the best idea. Those Melkor's Chosen, which still have plenty of life left in them, I mean there was plenty of good opportunities for charging here, have ultimately been thrown away against the one unit that was of, you know, an extremely high threat level to them, which is unfortunate. Meanwhile, these marksmen carry around another good charge. The Camel's Dragon Knights faring significantly better than their Orcish compatriots, although that may now come to an end as well, with the Glade Lords charging into them, Lumbermen from the side, the jaws being slammed shut by the Pinneth Galen cavalry as well, and now also another charge coming from the Mithrandir's retinue, and they end up routing as well. I mean, that was a really devastating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 punch, really, for the Dragon Knights. Now they're going to be finished off as well by Guards of Oscilia, so that was fairly grisly. Speaking of fairly grisly, the Mithrandir's retinue is now even able to get some good work done. A nice charge coming in there on the flag room, and the defenders really haven't managed to get their defence organised all that well here. In spite of the, again, they had around 10,000 frames to get this stuff under control, and they have not managed to do that, which is, again, disappointing to say the least. But I mean, the good news for them is they still have plenty of really useful tools, such as Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen, the Easterling crossbows in general. I'm sure there's a couple of units of Rangers skulking around here. These are the sorts of things which can equalise the fight back into their favour once again. Both units of Gondorian cavalry coming in to finish off this unit of Flag Room, so yet more kills in favour of the attackers here. Glade Lords move forward, and there's so many gaps in the defence here. This again is cardinal sin, really. You've allowed one of your most frightening tools to be completely exposed to cavalry charges. I mean, this maybe isn't slightly less recommended by the Glade Lords, considering the proximity of those Gamprim, but they didn't actually take too much damage because they cycled out pretty quickly. I mean, they still have the Dragon's Wrath crossbow, so that means they still have all the ammunition, but that was a charge they never needed to take in the first place, and they're still effectively in a fighting retreat here, the defenders. In spite of the relatively small surface area of the settlement they still have left to defend, they are doing a remarkably poor job of it. Pinithgalen cavalry coming in here, charging in. I mean, it's bold to try and do that against the Gamp Rim, but considering the damage they've already taken, you can actually smash a phalanx like that. As the third movie taught us, if you have the momentum, it is possible. But Medieval 2 is somewhat unforgiving when you engage in such reckless acts with your cavalry, but I suppose the cavalry isn't going to be that useful from here on in, so they just need to try and do as much damage as they can right here, right now. In comes the Dorwinion infantry, Helvellyn infantry, backed up by the additional bit of damage that the lumberman offers them, and they're still trying to do this fighting retreat. I mean, it's remarkable how the defenders have folded in these initial defensive lines. I mean, they're running out of time, basically. It's a 5v3. They're already significantly down in terms of what sort of damage they've actually been able to do so far. The attackers have played this really very, very well. They've seen the weaknesses for what they are, and they've gone for them really aggressively, not let up, no mercy shown. And so far, you'd have to say, it's been a very competent performance from them. Mirror opposite of what we've experienced from the defenders thus far. Morannon archers firing down into this block. The combination of Minas Morgul Chosen and Morannon Halberds is a decent front line, and with all of these ranged attacks coming in, this is exactly the sort of thing the defenders need to be doing a little bit more of. But again, considering all of the armour that Dorwinion and Gondor generally come equipped with, they will be more resistant to this sort of thing than most factions, but javelins will be exactly the sort of thing which will be very useful, which is what these Balcroft tribesmen are trying to engage in right now, although they are taking arrow fire as well, pulling out those little karambit knives. It is those Morannon archers providing the main bulk of the support so far. Over here, meanwhile, Rhun continuing to pull back in these positions over here. This could be a little bit concerning, I suppose, for the attackers, the fact that there is just this one tiny opening that they can attack through over here. Not a particularly inviting place for them to attack again. The Pinithgalen cavalry moving forward, not allowing the Gamp Rim to retreat as easy as they would. Nice charge as well, good amount of damage. They will take some casualties in return, the Pinithgalen cavalry, but not only did that charge do damage, but also now the archers can get a couple more volleys off to do even more damage this unit of Gamp Rim. Again, Steelbow's poor halberds have not been able to get set this entire battle. I mean, part of that is because he has been continuously retreating them, but also the absolutely ruthless exploitation of that from the attackers. Variag Bowman firing down onto the low ground. And that Gamp Rim still exposed somewhat. I think that, yeah, they're going to be able to get inside now, which will make the lives of those Pinithgalen cavalry a little bit more difficult in terms of trying to stop them again. They do manage to, though. Fighting in this sort of locale is not exactly ideal for a unit of pure shock cavalry like they are, however. Let's go and have a look at what's happening over here. Sapphire Bladesmen or Javelin, so really trying to make the most of their Javelin presence on the field now. The defenders try and crack through the armour of the men of the south and technically the northeast. Morannon archers still in a good position to continue firing. Balcroft tribesmen still the troll drummers, purely for cosmetic purposes of course, but even still, nice to see them. And the pikes moving forward. Maybe ease off on the pikes for the moment from an attacking perspective, purely because there's still quite a lot of javelins here, and you don't necessarily need them to gain the upper hand at this stage. Moraquendi bows, what are they firing at? Poison arrows hitting into the right part of a defending front line, considering the situation at the moment, would be a good idea. Meanwhile, just keeping their units in cover here, Lyon. There's hammer gardeners pikes, that's fairly interesting. Nice little cubby hole to keep your units until the time is right. Variag Bowman getting some shots in return now from the Gondor Militia Archers. Gondor Militia Archers, of course, very freely able to use their ammunition without fear of it really being wasted. Which is a problem for the Variag Bowmen, because they're going to need to respond in kind. We've seen this time after time in these large-scale sieges, where the defenders effectively are forced into using their ammunition on something they don't really want to use it on. Dragon's Wrath crossbow now using their ammunition, perhaps more out of necessity than anything else. They're not getting the best of angles for body-piercing projectiles, but they're getting shot by enemy archers, and considering the damage they've already taken, it's not the best of situations. Gondor infantry is shaken. I think they're trying to force path their way through, but Medieval 2 pathfinding means they're sort of losing control a little bit. Helvelan infantry taking damage from the Dragon's Wrath crossbow projectiles as they rip through. I mean, that is the double-edged sword, I suppose. If they do manage to get through this front line, they will be right in the view line of the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen, and that will do a lot of damage to the Gondorians and the men of Dorwinion. Men and elves of Dorwinion, I should say. Helvelan infantry here. What have we got going on? Some Gondor militia archers, presumably out of ammunition, being used as just a first scouting party into this area. But yeah, over on this side you can see that this is a pretty nasty defensive position, a very narrow area to get your reinforcements out. And they're also shoring things up with plenty of halberds, some higher tier spears, bodyguard tier infantry as well. So this will be an area where potentially the defenders can start to make up the deficit they've built up thus far. Even still, it is over here where the attackers will probably have more joy just because they've got a little bit more room to work with. Even still, they are taking a lot of damage from archers and javelins, so the defenders have managed to finally choose a sure place to stand and do a fair amount of damage, but this front line isn't going to last too much longer. I mean, they're having to commit stuff like Balkoth, Tribesmen and Morannon archers to the front line just to keep it afloat, which is generally not a brilliant sign. Orc javelins as well, not the kind of unit that you can really rely upon too much to be that melee powerhouse that you may require. Troll drummers still banging away, Balkoth Tribesmen, more of them on the way forwards. Still how many Minas Morgul Chosen are there in there? Still 91, so that's a decent amount. The Mordor heavy spears acting as they often are as the bulwark of their front lines. High armour value that they have. Pretty good against these more rank and file Gondorians and Dorwinion soldiers as well. There's a few armour piercing units like the Lumbermen in there. There may be a few Citadel Guard as well. I can see some Black Capes, but even like the Ravenhounds, good base damage, but none of that is armour piercing. What have we got going on here? A defensive piece of artillery. Troll catapult shooting into the back ranks. I mean, you can see how far the attacking army still extends, however. I mean, there is a downside to this, and that is the fact that quite a lot of their reinforcements are still quite a long way away from the fight. This is a fairly aggressive move here from Dorwinion and Gondor. I like this because going in drips and drabs would not have helped them given the level of the defence they were facing, but they're just going in really aggressively. They're going to need more reinforcements. If they continue to commit reinforcements here before the defenders are really set to meet them, then that is exactly the way to overcome this kind of defence. Nurad, Footman, Halberds, Brotherhood of the Spear, plenty of good quality from Can. I mean, the downside to this may be Proxima Century. If he gets one good hit into the middle there, it'll send a lot of these attacking warriors routing. For the time being, though, they are content to just use basic arrow fire, which both of their armies will be pretty good at resisting, but I mean, it's still good damage nonetheless. And ultimately, if they do not get reinforcements fairly soon, this assault will still come unstuck with the quality of the Brotherhood units the Carmel's chosen, the armour piercing that's coming from the Candish units that are on station as well. Yes. Helvelan infantry are on the way forward now. There's still that unit of Gondor militia archers, which is it stuck? It just seems to be hanging out there when there's no good reason for it. If it's out of ammo, just throw it in. May as well at this point. Now then, over here, Orc javelins are still on the front line. I mean, this attack does seem to be sort of dying down a little bit. There's plenty of units that you can put forward as reinforcements, which you do need to. You need to keep the assault going. It's never a good sign for attackers when an attack completely fails. Some out of ammunition, more recommended bows, plenty more Helvelan infantry coming forward though. We've seen them several times in the more recent battles that have featured Dorwinion be used to really good effect. A really solid backbone to an army. They may not be as exciting as the elven elements of the Dorwinion army perhaps, but they are still very dependable. Out of ammunition, Helvelan marksmen, again, the armour makes them survivable enough to actually be useful on the front line. Going to try and force their way through the front line here with this unit of Morroquindi Blade Lords. Uncle has used these very aggressively and to pretty good effect, as with most of the attacking cavalry so far. They were used far better than the defending cavalry, which is a rare enough sight. They are going to manage to get through here, and they will be able to get into this rather exposed unit of tribesmen. I don't think they have ammunition left, but just the fact that there is now cavalry behind enemy lines, and this is obviously a bit of a concern as well. Carnal Shadowbows trying to get into position to shoot into the front line over here, but they have been seen, and that means that the Elven archers are going to try and go after them. Doubtless the Dorwinion cavalry is also going to try and put them at the top of their list. Glade Lord's taking a bit of damage here. They do need to be careful not to get caught up for too long, because there's plenty of halberds and spears and that sort of thing. Olag High coming in, if they get into sustained melee with them, that's going to again be pretty bad news for the Dorwinion cavalry. They're still going after the Shadowbows. I mean, that is the clear target here. They will get a few kills, but I don't know if the Glade Lords are actually going to last all that much longer, given the pressure that they're under. Trolls are still here. The unit's getting a little bit stretched now because it's getting caught on several units of different combatants. Mithrandir's retinue are there, trying to maybe do the same sort of thing. A unit of Moran on halberds is fighting to the death. Broken fighting to the death is actually an opportunity now for the attackers to push through here, because they will fold like wet tissue paper now that that is the case. A few more units of infantry, and that will be the way. Meanwhile, yeah, they're starting to push over through the sides now. More reinforcements are what is required. Gondor infantry are struggling so far against the Brotherhood of the Sword. Is that Dragon's Crossmen have pulled back, and I mean, this is a much more fertile hunting ground for them than the other side. Shooting into this blob of Dorwinion and Gondorians is exactly the sort of damage values that are needed to break up this assault pretty quickly, and that will give them the leg up in this fight that they have been needing for a little while at this point. Again, like I said, it was an unfortunate charge that they took earlier on, but the fact that they still had full ammunition means it doesn't really matter too much as long as you can still use that ammunition constructively, and so far they have. So what began with really a fairly significant series of disasters for the defenders, they have managed to stabilise. I don't know whether that will be enough to carry them to victory. I heard Sir Ian McKellen's voice there. Must be from the Mithrandir's retinue. Forward go Dorwinion again, carrying their momentum forward, and once again the defenders having to retreat to a better place to stand. And that is going to be here by the looks of things. Will any units get caught out? Probably not, but they are going to get shot by a few more volleys of arrows first. A few units of Sauron's will, definitely the sort of thing they'll want to target down as well. That armour piercing, bit of a concern, especially for the Gondorian players among the attackers. Is this attack still going? I mean, it is, but it's looking far less unified at this point. I'm not sure this clutch of Gondor infantry is going to last all that much longer, considering they're being pinned in place by a unit of Brotherhood of the Spear. And again, that unit of Gondor militia archers has now moved forward, but that's not exactly the sort of thing at this point which is going to be required. They're going to need more quality, more numbers in general, and they can achieve that. They've still got plenty of units left in reserve. Helvellyn infantry moving backwards. Guards of Osgiliath, pikes, can they get set? Maybe. I mean, Citadel Guard are on the front line as well. Lots of this ammunition being buried into the dirt right in front of this unit of Variac bowmen, but they're trying to thin out the enemy as they move forward as best they can. Still a unit of Pinneth Gaeling cavalry as well. Meanwhile, over on the other side of this residential area, there's a little bit of symmetry to the attack at this point. Oof, they nearly charged in there. They only just avoided the tips of those halberds. In come the lumbermen, the Morroquendi pikes getting into position as well. I mean, the Morroquendi pikes can keep all of these Orcish and Easterling halberdiers at arm's length. Exactly the sort of thing you want in this kind of fight. But are there going to be enough of the Elven pikemen at this point? Also, do those Orc javelins have ammunition? Because they would be exactly the sort of thing you could use to thin out this very dangerous unit. Helvellyn marksmen firing away. Helvellyn Vine Guard in behind. They're going to need more units coming forward here, and like I said, I mean, the attackers, they've got a lot of units still left, but they're very stretched. They need to get their units a little bit closer to the action for me, because at this point they're being a little bit stingy on their front lines, and that is exactly the sort of thing which could allow the defenders back into this fight, and based on how well the attackers did earlier on, there's no way they should be allowing such things to happen. In come the Olag High, waddling into melee with their hammers and clubs raised. Damage done to their own settlement there. Unfortunately going astray for the Troll Catapult crew. Olag High doing their thing. Nimlothian Honor Guard adding themselves to the front line. I was wondering why the frame rate was collapsing there, and it's because one of the domes on the buildings was falling apart. I mean, the Nimlothian Honor Guard getting into melee, that armor piercing will be useful against the trolls, and just having that unit of really genuine quality on the front line is also going to be of concern for the defenders. Sauron's Will moving forward. Orc Javelins do have ammunition, so this is the moment for them to be useful. No, that was a blank shot. Unfortunate. As the fires rise in the settlement. Meanwhile, Nandor Glade Guard marching alongside the Gondorian Citadel Guard and Guards of Osgiliath. I mean, the Nandor Glade Guard will do a lot more damage. You can see that the more fragile elements of this front line are now starting to rout in the face of yet another aggressive push from the attackers. This is a little bit more like it. Plenty of Elvelins in there as well to help fill things out. Brotherhood of the Sword getting onto the front line is still Variag Bowman. Do they have anything else? I mean, this is going to be a decent amount of damage that they're capable of doing up here with these Brotherhood of the Shadows. Good amount of armor piercing damage as well. Will it be enough? I mean, it's not as impressive certainly as the Dragon's Wrath crossbows were. Standardly strong crossbows might be a good thing as well. Nomadic Marauders throwing their javelins in. It's a little bit haphazard, but they will be doing decent damage across the entirety of this little assault. Victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. Quite so. Elvelin Marksman firing back and going after these strong crossmen. This is where that armour upgrade will start to pay dividends, but it's still not ideal for the Eastrons. Definitely not the sort of unit that enjoys being under arrow fire regardless of their level of armour that they have. More javelins coming in, this time from the attacking side. The Keldon River Patrol. Again, this is bad news for the defenders. I just don't know if they're going to be able to have the... I mean, the numbers that Mordor, Rhun and can bring to the field when they're together are not insubstantial, but I just don't know whether they're going to have the numbers to be able to withstand this kind of punishment for much longer, whereas the attackers still have plenty of reinforcements they can commit forward. They're going to need units like the Guildsmen, like the Eastron Crossbowmen. Any ranged units that are capable of doing a lot of damage quickly, they're going to need those to start doing the business fairly soon in this fight. Yet another unit of Vine Guard arrives on the front line. I mean, this little side assault, Morroquendi Pikes and the Nimlothian Honor Guard almost completely gone. Combination of crossbow bolts and throwing daggers doing the business there, certainly. Meanwhile, certainly more ground is being made up, and again, looks like desperation settings for the defenders as nomadic marauders are being tasked with defending this front. One of the attacking generals falls. I wonder if that is... Was it Pro Gamer? What was his name? The Gondorian player that's not Beastie 70. I believe that was his general. The one with the very elite focused army. Rhun. Shot catapult firing away. What is going on over here then? Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen out of ammunition. I mean, they're a good melee combatant as well, but they're somewhat limited and they're not exactly heavy duty troops on the front line. They're much better as a supporting unit in this sort of situation. When they are the sole fighter on the front line, that's a little bit less ideal for them. Well, yeah, units like the Elvelin Marksman will be a constant problem for the defenders here. Not the most damaging archer, but a constant menace for them in this kind of situation. They're running out of steam, I think. I mean, they've got other defensive lines they can pull back to, but at this point I don't think they do pull back. It's going to be all that great for them. Keldon River Patrol pulling out their swords, getting into melee, Lumberman. It's not often that the Orcs of Mordor find themselves on the receiving end of an unrelenting assault like this, I think, but That's exactly what this battle has been so far. Sapphire Bladesmen trying to throw what javelins they can before they get engaged in melee here by some lumbermen. Pulling out those Falxes that they have, but there's not many of them left, and there is a unit of Carmel's Chosen, but again, if they were going to reinforce this front line in this manner, they probably should have done it a little bit sooner, because they're effectively trying to reinforce it when it's already fallen. Unfortunate, but it is what it is. Over on the other side, still the slow progress continues. These Carmel's Chosen have been on the front line on this side for quite a while at this point. Only 13 of them remain. And there is a unit of Brotherhood of the Sword that have been committed now, which is something. Nomadic infantry that are out of ammunition, getting ready to engage with the enemy as well. Those were clear projectiles, which are throwing daggers. Brotherhood of the Shadows doing their thing. There is a bit of routing going on there and in amongst the ranks of the attackers, but it's in their least important units, so I don't think they will mind too much from that perspective. Rhun leaving patches of fire where their arrows land. The attack looking a little bit more thin on the ground now. The addition of that Brotherhood of the Sword unit has made a fairly substantial difference, but again the pressure continues over on this side. This unit of Carmel's Chosen, its retreat being denied by a unit of Elvelyn marksmen. They are almost certainly going to be surrounded and destroyed. Elsewhere, Peneth Galen cavalry moving forward. Good opportunity to charge into the Orc Javelins, perhaps. This unit of single HP cavalry has been used very, very well so far, and we will be able to see how many kills they've got at the end. Ooh. The Javelin volley does come in just in time, but they do manage to land the charge nonetheless and get yet more kills. Brutal. They're going to be able to get away here, the Carmel's Chosen. I mean, they're only up against Lumbermen and basic Elvelyn marksmen, not exactly the strongest melee combatants. They're far, far stronger than both of those units are in melee. Peneth Galen cavalry broken and fighting to the death as they try to retreat back through the Carmel's Chosen. That's an unfortunate end for a unit that's been so effective so far in this battle. Forward come the Elvelyn Vanguard. I think that some of those Carmel's Chosen are going to be able to get away, but not nearly enough as they would have hoped. Meanwhile, Elvelyn infantry coming in from the sides, and now they're going to be able to attack from multiple angles in this little area over here. And leading the way on that count is the Mithrandir's retinue, getting in amongst all of these units and making a real nuisance of themselves. Again, more bad news for the defenders. They're not going to be able to reinforce this front line anymore, and surely that's going to mark the end of this. I mean, the Brotherhood of the Sword made a good difference for a while, but more units from the attackers were always going to be forthcoming. Plenty more projectiles coming in, so they can at least do damage to them in the best way that they're able. We're into the final 10k frames now, well and truly. And there's really nowhere left to retreat to at this point. That raised bit of terrain that is just up there near the palace is the only place the defenders have left to stand now. So this is going to have to be a do or die. And I feel as though it's probably going to be die based on how the battle has gone so far. Camille's shadow bows could be a really useful unit in this sort of situation. Crossbowmen, looks like a lot of what they have left is actually ranged units, so if they're going to win this fight, the defenders, they need to dump all of their damage quickly now. Ardenheim shadow bows, Temple Guard, I mean this is a real firing range at this point. What the attackers cannot afford to do really is dawdle, and the somewhat stretched nature of how far back their units are may work against them in that respect. Still, the seemingly inexhaustible supply of Elvelyn units keep up the assault over here. Mithrandir's retinue are broken, so I think that's pretty much the end of any cavalry play that we're going to be seeing in this battle. Nurad Halberds fighting in conjunction with some Brotherhood of the Axe, plenty of armor piercing, which is going to be horrendous news for Elvelyn infantry. An officer there. One's of the White Tower on the way forward from Gamer Data, that's it, not Pro Gamer. Still got both of those units, which of course that sort of quality will help in the late game. Brotherhood of the Shadows committing themselves to melee as well, very similar to the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. good melee combatant, but again, not exactly a heavy-duty kind of unit. Plenty of projectiles. More strong crossbowman. I mean, you'd have to assume that if any of these front lines do collapse at any point, the absolutely overwhelming number of defending units up here are ranged units, which means they can do tons of damage while the attackers are, again, dawdling down here. But as soon as they get engaged in melee, you wouldn't really fancy their chances. They still haven't actually managed to force their way through here, though, the attackers, which is somewhat interesting. Balance of force is still evenly matched, and again, just more damage being done from afar. Still, you know, very bowman, just been stood up there, keeping an eye out for quite a while at this point. Don't know exactly what the point of sending individual units of Elvalin infantry to what's effectively a swift demise at the hands of all of these armor-piercing units is, but maybe I just do not see the genius. Why are they not going this way? There's only a unit of orc javelins, you need to get up there. Where on earth are the rest of their reinforcements? They're sort of stumbling over themselves here, the attackers. They should be going on to win this fight without too many issues. They seem to be trying to make life as difficult as possible for themselves. Which I'm not entirely sure why. Very bowman. Moving down here, Brotherhood of the Sword are in there, and addition of Wardens of the White Tower to this front line is definitely making a difference. The fire being spread by the Easterlings. When it lands like that, it's purely cosmetic, but it looks neat. Very bowman thinking of getting into melee over there. Instead, they may be attempting to reinforce over here, which actually may not be all that necessary. Norad Halberds and Brotherhood of the Axe seem to have this fight under control just fine, as it is. Variag Bowman getting into melee with the Elvalin Marksmen, stopping them from firing, trying to take away what support the attackers have. Ooh, Norad Stormguard, that's one of the few units of melee infantry they still had in reserve, and it's a pretty substantial one. Exactly the sort of thing that these Gondorians on the front line won't like fighting. They'll be relying on the Guards of Osgiliath to try and keep them at arm's length, but that is of course what all of those projectiles are for. Right, now, are they moving up here? They are. It's about damn time. If they'd have done this sooner, this fight would probably already be... the dominoes would be falling. But as it is, they may have given the defenders just that little bit of time they needed to do the damage they wanted. Plenty more crossbow bolts doing their thing. Wardens of the White Tower, I mean, Keldon Roof Patrol routing almost immediately. They're extremely depleted, very, very weak in comparison to the Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen. Not many of the Carmel's chosen remain. More Quendi pikes taking some javelin fire, more units on the way up. The other unit of Wardens of the White Tower is having to go toe-to-toe with Temple Guard and Executioners. Wardens of the White Tower are good, but they're not quite as good here as their Black Numenorian counterparts. Such is the way of things. Hammer Guard are on their way up. That armor piercing will be useful. They just need to flood over. They've done such a good job so far, the attackers, of carrying momentum through, finding gaps by being really aggressive, and they've faltered in the late game here. They've allowed the defenders to get back into this somewhat. Norad Storm Guards still doing their thing. All of those clear projectiles coming from the rear, those Carmel's shadow bows, are going to try and deal with this defensive position once and for all, and they will be able to with these numbers, but more kills were fed into this front line than was absolutely necessary. Elvalin Marksmen still firing into the backs there of the Norad Storm Guard. More units on the way, Keldon Roof Patrol, Elvalin Marksmen. Pikes on the way forward, are they managing to do the kind of damage they need to? Dragon's Wrath Crossmen in trouble. Beastie's General falls at the hands of the Storm Guard. Morroquendi Glade Mass is in behind enemy lines, and to absolutely no one's surprise, they are ripping Orc Javelins limb from limb. This is exactly the sort of with Elval and Hammer Guard and Nandor Glade Guard, so yeah, Rangers and Javelins in melee. Elsewhere, things aren't quite so simple for the attackers, but I think the problem is the defenders just don't have the infantry to cover all of their skirmishes at this point. They're doing their best to continue to use stuff like their E-Strong crossbows to good effect, and they are firing into stuff like the Glade Masters, doing good damage. Unit of 104 Keldon with Patrol on the way forwards as well. There goes the Runic General. Yeah, the attackers are just going to have too much. I mean, in spite of their own best efforts to give the defenders a fighting chance going into the late game here, it's not going to quite be enough, I think, for the defenders in the long run. They just don't have the ability to defend all the units that they need to defend in order to make this work still. Narrim and Nomadic Infantry trying to consolidate here in this higher defensive position. Morquendi bows, those poison projectiles will of course be a real problem to especially the runic units. They're thinking of routing now that their general has fallen. Elval and Hammer Guard getting in behind enemy lines, silencing yet another unit of E-Strong crossbowmen which the defenders so badly needed. They do still have those Temple Guard with their armor-piercing arrows. They're going after something very soft and squishy though, which makes me think it's almost the cynic in me thinks that Mordor is trying to pad their kill count out as much as possible before the game ends by killing off a more numerous, easier to kill unit. The Temple Guard would be far better placed going after something more elite. But, you know, it is what it is. Can't begrudge them that at this late stage, I suppose. Nomadic Infantry fighting off against some of the Elval in and amongst the catapults. What remains of the Dragon's Wrath crossbows, who are amazingly still alive. They've been engaged in melee more times than I can remember in this fight at this stage. And over here, I mean, the defenders will hold on here for pretty much the remainder of the fight. The Nurad Stormguard will defeat Pelagia Marines unless they allow them to shoot into them in that fashion. But Can will win that fight, but there's nothing else they can really do. Another unit of Nurad Stormguard, which is down here, which has actually turned this fight down here around once again. Nurad Stormguard, such an effective unit, definitely not to be taken lightly, especially against the kind of foes they've been fighting off against. It's been pretty much their ideal battle, with the exception of not having quite the level of support that maybe they would have wanted. Rhun taking some damage. There goes yet another. Actually, so the one that died over there must have been a Dorwinion general. This one was Gamer Data's general, who is still trying to bring down the Temple Guard and Temple Executioners that are over here, and still the Wardens of the White Tower are struggling. There's a few Morquendi with them, but and as we go into the late game here, 4% is the advantage that the attackers still have. It's still Nurad Stormguard and the likes. I mean, I suppose it's not completely beyond the realms of possibility that the quality of the defenders actually does lead this battle to turn around. That would be not the worst throw of a battle I've ever seen. That will forever be that one on Edoras, but it would be a fairly substantial stumble here if the attackers were to somehow not be able to close this out. Carmel's shadow bows, can they rout off what remains of the runic army? That would be a big victory for them. Still Elval marksman, Nurad Stormguard. Are there enough Stormguard to keep all of these Elvalan units at bay at this point? I don't think so. Again, it's just going to come down to numbers, and fine margins though. If the defenders had been a little bit more well organised early on, then these attacking stumbles in the late game I think would have been enough to actually give the defenders the win. But it is what it is. Still this unit of Gondor Militia Archers, I guess it must be stuck. It must just be forever lodged in place. Meanwhile, Pelagia Marines of course being killed fairly easily by Nurad Stormguard. Elval and Hammer Guard on the way to try and maybe help deal with them, or maybe first charge into the backs of these units over here. There's Narrim trying to get in their way as best they are able. Temple Guard being defeated by the Elval and Hammer Guard, that armor piercing, and the fact that they are a dedicated infantry unit at the end of the day, making all the difference here. That is probably the Mordor general, if I had to guess, with the Temple Executioners being here, but still, Mordor's units that remain are not the ones that are going to rout, so they don't really have to worry too much. Still some Temple Guard. Still some Nazgul, actually. Yeah. 3% the difference. I mean, that is closing. I didn't realise the Nazgul was still here. Considering... Where's the Candace General gone? It is very close, actually, mainly because the quality of units that the defenders still have left, despite the fact that they are still losing in terms of percentages, they have the more high quality units. The Nazgul make a really significant difference, because it's not as if like the attacks at this point have the numbers to be able to surround and destroy the Nazgul, and with Temple Executions, yeah, I think the defenders are going to win this, actually. Looking at this, 11 Temple Guard. Well, well, well. In spite of one of the more horrific, actually, starts to a 5v3 defense I saw, I thought this was going to be a fairly simple affair for the attackers, but in the end they have well and truly fumbled it in the late game. They dawdled for far, far too long in the view sights of all of those ranged units, and they are going to be made to pay the price for that here, I think. Yeah, there's too many Storm Guard left. The Nazgul. And all they really have left to deal with the situation now is units of Elvelyn. So there you go. Everyone had their moments of glory and their moments of utter failure in this fight, I think it's fair to say. But in the end, looking like there goes another Dorwinion general. Yeah, and that's going to be it. It continues to close up, but I mean, percentages at this point may not be the most reliable thing, because so many units are going to be routing. The fact of the matter is, the units that remain, Rhun may be the defending faction that has nothing left by the end, because I think this Nar Rim is the only thing Steelbow has left. Mordor and Khand have still got their strongest units left available to them, and that is going to be the end of proceedings. MISTRAND defended. I completely forgot they had the Nazgul, and yet here they are. That unit of Vanguard, just a couple of units of Dorwinion spears remain. They rout, which leaves this unit over here, who are being, and have been being, introduced for some time now to the business end of the Storm Guard's halberds and those sort of wavy pikes, which are kind of Chinese in style, I believe. So an eclectic mix of all the various Asian styles, the Storm Guard. Mongol, Japanese, Chinese, everything. And that is going to be that. The Elvelyn Marksmen, the last ones left alive by the looks of things. And what a comeback. Considering how things started for them, that is a pretty remarkable victory from the defenders. I do think it has quite a lot to do with how the attackers just were far too slow in this final stage. It is interesting though, usually defending mistakes, as we saw earlier on, are punished more harshly than attacking ones, but I guess the scale of that was something that I kind of underestimated as the battle was going along. But then again, there are always outliers. It definitely didn't follow the same sort of pattern that we've seen 5v3s in the past, and on this occasion the defenders able to take advantage of such things. So, yeah, really interesting fight that. As I've said all throughout, early on it looked like for all the world the defenders were going to dig themselves a hole from which they would never really escape. But in the end, the attackers gave momentum back to them in the late game, and in the end it was the defending quality that was able to see them over the line. So, pretty remarkable fight from that perspective, I suppose. And it's interesting just to note that the blue team didn't win, so people can't even complain at me for that this one time. So yeah, big thank you to Beastie70 for sending this one in. Definitely a bizarre but very interesting fight, and it's nice to see MISTRAND again. And no technical maladies to report, which, considering this was always a map which did have some issues in the past, it's nice to see that this one isn't plagued by the same issues that Plagued Moria, and it has been quite a while since we've seen this, probably over a year actually at this point since we saw this map last. So yeah, interesting. Very mixed. I can't really say who was an MVP, who played poorly or anything like that, because I think everyone had their good moments and bad moments in this fight. It was one of those very weird back and forth. Uncle with not that many kills, but I mean he used his cavalry very well, but I guess the main body of his army was focused down more so than he would have liked. 479 from Gamer Data as well. His composition, I would say, was not great. If he had a more traditional army composition, I think that it would have been too much for the defenders, because there would have been a fuller army that would have been coming at them, as opposed to whatever abomination he decided to put together based on almost entirely elite units with nothing else around it. It's not really so much of an army than it is a collection of just the strongest units that you can field, and in the end, look at the size of the army. It's, you know, basically Uncle's army was the next smallest, and that was almost double the size of that one, so that was something which maybe could have been done differently. It's the most obvious thing that you can see from here anyway. But let's see what did the damage for Beastie 70. Wardens of the White Tower struggled a bit. Citadel Guard, I think the initial unit this was, 225 kills, that's very impressive on that initial runic front line, which did start to fall apart. The rest of his army though, I mean 92 on a unit of Gondor infantry is pretty good, because they're rather rank and file, outperforming several others. Guards of Osgiliath with 170, Pinnith Galen Cavalry with 165, so that's a good amount of kills on a unit of basic shock cavalry. Again, we saw the cavalry from the attackers used very, very well, but in the end I guess the ranged units from the defenders were also used very well, hence their victory. Mithrandir's retinue, again, attacking cavalry doing quite well, but the rest of his army, considering how much he spent on those Wardens of the White Tower, Trebuchet, not really worth it, all things considered. Would have been far more useful to his team if he had brought a more sensible regular army than trying to go too heavily into these elite units. But it was that was part of the reason why the defenders were able to get back into this. So I suppose we have that to thank for having such an interesting battle in the first place. So yeah, I mean, this replay, I am recording it in the first third of December, but it's probably going to be coming out in early January at some point, so it will be the new year by now. As for what's going to be coming up, I do have another replay on Merlond, which we'll be doing probably towards the tail end of January, because it wasn't too long ago we saw that map, and it is a bit of a repeat map that we see fairly often. Something else is going to be the Cardland Outpost, which has been sort of the de facto version of Tharbad for quite a while at this point, so that's something else, another repeat map that we have seen in the past, which will be coming out in a fairly short order. By this point I'll also be looking to get the top 5 spear infantry video out for Rise of Mordor. That's again something which will be coming towards the tail end of January, and there are a couple of other Silmarillion replays as well which I currently have on the back burner. But yeah, plenty of stuff to be getting on with, as I mentioned in my Christmas update as well. Plenty of opportunity for upheaval in 2022, but all of that would probably be positive for the channel, so hopefully then we can look to expand back out the content, but it's not likely that will be happening certainly in the first quarter of the year. So at least for the foreseeable future, things will be continuing as they have done for pretty much the past 10 to 11 months. Irregardless of that, once again, big thank you to Beastie70 and all of the players for a rather strange but very entertaining battle for MISTRAND. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.